Wanted to share some examples of photographers and photographs using the three alternative photographic processes that we're going to learn in this class: cyanotypes, gum bichromate prints, and anthotypes. Cyanotype is a fairly quick and easy process. Uses two chemicals, potassium ferrocyanate and ferric ammonium citrate, that you mix separately with distilled water. And then when you mix them in equal parts together, they create a light-sensitive solution. This is a process that was developed just a few years after photography was introduced in 1839. The blueprint or cyanotype process came out in 1842. It was discovered and developed by Sir John Herschel in Britain. Anna Atkins was early to use the cyanotype process. She was a botanist and was interested in creating a scientific illustration of various forms of algae. And she did these cyanotype impressions in a book where she simply took these botanical specimens, laid them on top of a piece of sensitized cyanotype paper, exposed them to sunlight. My guess is she probably put a piece of glass on top to hold the whole thing flat. Exposed them to sunlight. The chemical reacts to the light, usually in just a couple of minutes on a good sunny day. Mike Ware is a contemporary photographer. He's come up with a new cyanotype process. It's a little more involved than the process that we're going to use, but something that you might want to advance to. A characteristic of the new process, and I think you can see it in this image, it holds a more varied collection of blue tones. In other words, you can get a longer gray scale or a longer blue scale, as it were, with the new process. The process we're going to use is a good introduction to the cyanotype. It's a simple, direct, and easy process. It's a little more contrasty than what you're going to see in this Mike Ware photograph. Catherine Jensen was a photographer in the 70s and 80s that was doing these cyanotype rooms. Here you can see that she coated sheets and bed pillowcases and even made a soft TV and a newspaper and other kinds of things completely out of cyanotype. Basically anything you can coat and get the cyanotype solution to stick. Once it receives enough ultraviolet light, it will turn dark, it will turn blue. And so you can do these on fabrics. When I used to teach this class in person, we would often do cyano t-shirts where we would coat a part of a front of a t-shirt and then put objects on it and make photograms like Jensen has done in this image here. As you see the couple lying on the bed, that I'm sure would have been a real couple, and expose that dried cyanotype coated sheet. But you can also see the pillowcases is a series of images, as is the TV, even as the shoes and clothing on the floor. Barbara Caston was working in Southern California when she made these images. These are fairly large 22 by 30 inch cyanotypes where she's putting various kinds of fabric down on top of a piece of cyanotype paper and exposing them to light, creating these layers of information and imagery. There's a variety of alternative photography websites out there, one called Alternative Photography, as well as Facebook groups. Some of these photographs, like this one, I simply pulled from what I found on some of those sites. So in this case, it's not a photographer I know a whole lot about, but I like the image. Christopher James, who wrote one of the definitive textbooks on alternative photography, does workshops in New England, often during the summer. You can see this as a class project. Undoubtedly, what this is an entire bed sheet that's been soaked in cyanotype solution, and then members of the class and their bike and some of the weeds and reeds and other kinds of things that lay around, lay on top of this for a few minutes while it exposed, and then they processed it. I thought this example was interesting to just show you don't have to use white paper. You can coat cyanotype solution on other color papers, and so the underlying image will be a different color rather than white if you use that. How the cyanotype works essentially is once you coat the paper and dry it, when ultraviolet light hits it, that part of the emulsion hardens. Where you have something blocking the light, after the other parts have hardened, you just come in and wash it off with water. I think I have a couple pieces here by Lori Snyder. I like the fact that she used the cyanotype to make these accordion-style fold-out books. Here's some of those pages. Also a book, but you can see now laid flat with two of the pages exposed. Just doing monotypes and cyanotypes. Monotype is a singular type of printmaking process. Or the idea of using these in a diaristic fashion. You can see the cyanotype around the edge where she would have most likely written on a piece of acetate with a magic marker or something similar to that, and use that as the written narrative that you see pieced around these other images. Or another cyanotype book, this in a more traditional format. Or using cyanotypes and another alternative process, the Van Dyck process, in the creation of this quilt. Betty Hahn was one of my instructors at the University of New Mexico. Really a delightful person. I enjoyed my time with Betty. Here you can see that she made a cyanotype print and then went back into that print and added watercolor. A similar piece, also by Betty Hahn, this time using the Van Dyck Brown print process, one that we're not going to do in this class this semester. Again, a photographer I found doing research about cyanotypes, again, not someone I know a ton about, but I thought her work was enticing and I wanted to share it with you. I love that they're elaborate and their sense of pattern. Pieced together here from fallen leaves. You can see she's also working at times with diptychs with two pieces of paper butted up against each other. Using mostly natural artifacts as her objects. A few examples of the gum bichromate process. Again, it's a historic process. This Edward Steichen photograph, I believe, made in 1902 or thereabouts, is a hand-colored gum bichromate print. This image once set auction records for the highest amount paid for a single photograph. But the Steichen piece displays some of the tonality and range that you can get with the gum bichromate process. One of the interesting things about the process is while it's light sensitive, it's essentially colorless. So what you do is you add pigment to the light sensitive process and you choose what color pigments you use. Some frankly work a little better than others, but you can make your image green or blue or red or any number of other colors because you're adding the pigment. So Steichen certainly was someone who did this around the turn of the last centuries. And like the cyanotype, it's a process where you coat your own emulsion, so sometimes you can leave brush marks. These are more contemporary photographers, Dan Esterbrook, and here you can see it's using the gum process and then adding to that both watercolor and colored pencil. Another one of his pieces here. Back to Betty Hahn. Again, my teacher in graduate school at University of New Mexico. She did a whole series of photographs in the 70s that she printed with gum bichromate on fabric, as you see here, and then stitched on the fabric. So the black and white is largely the photographic element, and then the added color that you see with the rainbow and the stripes on the road, as well as the striation or stripes on the roof of the building, are all added via stitching. Here's another one of those images. So for her gum bichromate part, she would have used a green pigment added to that, coated it on fabric, exposed and processed it, and then added elements, and what you see here with the red and the sort of silvery gray, and even some black, which are stitched onto the fabric. And one more of her pieces here. Again, images I found from the alternative photography website. Not photographers I know much about or frankly looked up, but I thought provided interesting examples in one way or another. This is a 3-color gum bichromate print. This photographer would have made separation negatives, separating the original image into 3 primary colors, and then printed them in registration on top of one another to approximate the look of a full color print. I just wanted to show you with this example the extensive detail that you can get with the gum bichromate process. This would require you to use a fairly smooth paper, one with less texture than the average watercolor paper. And the third process we're going to learn in this class is the anthotype. There are a few photographers today using the anthotype process. Again, it's a historic process. Here you can see Sir John Herschel's example from 1840. He's the person that invented the cyanotype process. I should tell you, if you haven't had the history of photography before, he's also the scientist who came up with in the 1830s the idea for the chemical that was used that stopped the development action of light-sensitive chemicals. It's called fixer, sodium thiosulfate. It's still used today in chemical photographic based processes, and it was the one chemical that was the last challenge for the 2 first processes that were announced to the world, the daguerreotype and the calotype. So Sir John Herschel had a vital role in the early days of photography. He also provided the name photography as well as a number of other contributions. The anthotype uses pigment from plant material. You can take flowers or vegetables or fruits and grind them into a liquid. Put them in your blender, grind them up if you need to in your blender, add a little water or alcohol to make them a little less soupy. But then you take that emulsion and you coat it on paper, allow it to dry, and then you put a positive on top of it, and then put that under ultraviolet light out in the sun. And the sun, the parts that the positive do not allow to hit, will block the sun from bleaching, but the sun should bleach out parts of the remaining image. This is a process that you're going to get faint results. You can see there's not a great deal of contrast in an image like this. This is a pretty good example, and again, this is a more recent photographer, a contemporary photographer, using pokeberries rather than flower petals. I'm going to show you a few different examples when I do the demo of possibilities. But again, this is one you can have fun with. The difficulty with this process is a couple of things. It's very flat, meaning you're going to have very little variance in tonalities, few shades of gray or a few shades of red or whatever color it may be, few shades of brown. And the exposure times are fairly long. For many of these emulsions, you may be looking at about a week-long exposure. So as you make these, plan accordingly. And frankly, if you get one good anthotype, I'd be perfectly pleased with that.